I'm going to demonstrate in this video the practice shapes assignment with value, intensity, and hue. And on this worksheet, each of the exercise has an alphabet letter printed on it, and I've typed up the instructions for students to follow along with. And the instructions should very clearly go over each activity step by step. So let's go ahead and start with A. So we have three shapes up here: a circle, a triangle, and a star. And the instructions say paint in each shape, choosing a different primary color for each one. So first off, we need to know what are our primary colors. We know from the color wheel that the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. So we need to use those. The instructions say practice neatness, painting very carefully up to the line, but not painting outside of the lines. You will be docked points for sloppiness. So I need to be very careful about the edges, and especially on this star over here, that it's a more complex shape, so I need to be careful about that. So I have three shapes and three primary colors, and I happen to be left-handed, and I know that when I start on the left and I work to the right, I'm more likely to smudge. So just that experience as a painter, I'm going to actually start with shape A first. And I'm going to go ahead and use some yellow paint that I just activated, so it might be a little bit watery at first. And I'm going to fill in A. And once I get rid of kind of the gloppiness of paint that's on my brush, and I start to run out a little bit, I can reach out towards those edges very carefully and paint inside the lines. This also helps if you have a smaller tipped brush, or a brush that once it's wet, its bristles stay clustered together better. Okay, being very careful at the edges. When I first dip my brush, I kind of hold it above the well for a couple seconds to make sure it's not going to drip, and then I move over to the spot that I'm going to paint and kind of pull that paint up to the edge but not over it. I'm working slowly and carefully. Now I'm going to switch primary colors, so I'm rinsing out my brush and blotting out the extra water. Blotting out the extra water can help make sure that you're not thinning out your paints too much when you switch from residual water in your brush. So like this red, you can tell it looks kind of pinkish because I just activated it, so it hasn't been wet for very long. Now, exercise B. It says wet on dry on the worksheet to clue you into the technique we're going to use on this. Exercise B says choose a secondary color to paint in the stripe. Paint directly onto the dry paper, carefully filling in the long rectangle. Try to make the color application consistent and smooth without streaks or blotchiness. This is called wet on dry technique. So I need to choose a secondary color. My choices are orange, green, and violet. So I'm going to go ahead and use violet. And it says to paint directly on the dry paper, so I'm going to fill up my brush and go for it. Again, I'm left-handed, so I'm actually going to kind of work opposite of what most students probably will. I'm going to paint on this side, and I'm going to try and fill in as neatly as I can this rectangle. What's going to help is if I sort of grab this color that I've put down. Sorry, I went off the camera. If I kind of grab this color from the edge and I move fast enough to sort of pull that puddle with it. If I pull that puddle, it's going to make it look a little more even on the end result. If I do a lot of short little strokes like this, and I don't have enough paint in my brush, those are going to absorb into the paper really fast, and they're going to leave behind the marks of the paintbrush. So I'm just kind of pulling my secondary color, violet, along the entire thing here. And you should be careful when you're painting in this rectangle. My exercise A, that's all still wet. So those 3 shapes at the top, if I run my hand over it, I'm going to smudge it and make a big mess. So anytime that it seems like I'm starting to run out of paint, I go back for more. I'm not just, I'm not like scraping the brush across the page. I'm gliding it in a layer of paint. There's always this very thin sort of sheen of paint on the page, and it's going to help even out when the whole area has enough paint on it. If you don't have enough paint in your brush, it's going to be hard to fill this shape, and it's going to absorb really fast and dry out really fast, and then the blotches are going to show. Alright, that looks good. Exercise C, wet on wet. It clues us in. Okay, it says, mix your own tertiary color. So I'm going to need to use my mixing tray. And a tertiary color, those are those in-between colors that are an imbalanced mix of 2 primaries or a primary plus a secondary. Then clean out your brush. Okay, so let's go ahead and follow along with the instructions. Make your own tertiary color and then clean out your brush. So because I just used a secondary color violet, why don't I go ahead and mix some violet. And it's okay to use the colors already in your paint set for this. You don't have to just stick to red, yellow, and blue. And I'm going to influence that with some primary. I'm going to add more red into this to make red violet. Okay, now my brush is still full of paint because I was just stirring these together. So I'm going to get rid of some of the excess. Sometimes if you sort of tap the edges on your palette, you can squeeze out most of the color so it doesn't go to waste. And then I'm going to go rinse this. Alright, the instructions say, next, dip your brush into clean water and paint water into the stripe as if using invisible paint. Blot your brush dry on the paper towel. Now use your mixed tertiary color to paint in the stripe on top of the water. The color should bleed across the shape and help you apply to color consistent and smooth. This is called wet on wet technique. So this one I painted directly on the dry paper. This one we're going to add water first. So my water is mostly clean. I haven't been using it for very long, but you can always go get clean water. And I'm going to fill this in with water first. And if you're using an itty bitty paintbrush, this might take forever. So if you have a slightly larger brush or a more absorbent natural hair brush, you might want to switch to that. So you probably are having a hard time seeing on the camera, but I am painting clean, clear water into this rectangle so that the paper is going to be wet when I do put color on it. And kind of like the last exercise, I'm sort of pulling that puddle along so there's a sheen. In watercolors, you learn how much you need that sheen on top, but I'm not making so much of a puddle that it's running all over the place and saturating my page. It's just glossy, and I'm working fast enough that this whole thing is still glossy. Now, blot your brush dry on the paper towel so it doesn't have a whole bunch of extra water. Now use your mixed tertiary color to paint in the stripe on top of the water. The color should bleed across. So watch this. When I touch my paint to the wet rectangle, it wants to spread out because this is the wet on wet technique. And instead of absorbing immediately into the dry paper, the water helps it spread out. And this is one way of getting a more even color application that doesn't get brush strokes and blotches, because the water helps average everything out. The water wants to flow and kind of spread the paint particles everywhere that the water touches. So hopefully you mixed up enough tertiary color to last in here. I had probably quarter-sized dollop of paint in my mixing tray. Now I've got a few wrinkles in my paper because this is a lower quality paper that it's printed on, but for the most part the color is spreading out and kind of averaging across here. Okay, that was the wet on wet, so I'm applying paint onto a wet surface. Wet paint, wet surface. Now we're going to take that one step further. Exercise D. Fill in the stripe with clean water like you did for C. So clean water. Now choose 2 primary colors to use and make sure they are hydrated. So let's go ahead and use red and blue since I'm sticking to a purple color scheme right now, just because I want to. Red and blue are primary colors. You're going to dip your brush into primary color 1 and paint in the very left side of the stripe, so this section through here. Clean brush and blot dry. Next, dip your brush into primary color 2 and paint in the right side of the stripe. The middle should be wet with water, but no paint. Clean brush and blot dry. Lastly, use your brush to pull these together and sweep them back and forth, creating a blend. Okay, so I need to work kind of quickly on this one because it's multi-steps and this rectangle is supposed to be full of water. So painting glossy layer into the rectangle. Should be clean water. Mine's got a teeny bit of a tinge to it, but you can always go to the sink and get fresh water. The more water you have in your cup, the longer it'll stay clean. If you have a smaller amount of water, then it's going to get contaminated and polluted pretty quickly when you're rinsing your brush out frequently. Alright, so glossy, wet layer. This is the wet on wet technique. And I'm supposed to pick a primary color. So I'm going to go with red and color in one side of the rectangle. I'm moving fast enough that this rectangle is wet and the water is supposed to help me, and then I stop there. Alright, now cleaning out my brush, blotting dry, going from the other side with my other primary color. And I'm filling in this side, trying to move quickly because as we speak my paper's drying out. You see how the water is pulling the two towards each other already, and I haven't even used my brush. Wet on wet encourages the paint to flow and move. Look at that. Okay, cleaning my brush, blotting it dry, and now I'm going to do a little bit of a stirring action in between. So I'm going to kind of grab some of that red and pull it this way, and grab some of that blue and pull it this way, and grab some of that red, pull it this way. Okay, so I'm inside that dotted line area and I've kind of pulled the colors together and it's turning purple, which is why I had you choose two primary colors, is so that when they combine it makes a pretty secondary color, purple. Or it could be red and yellow to make orange, or it could be yellow and blue to make green. This next section has 3 different exercises that are all focused on value the lightness or darkness of a color. So the instructions for this says choose a single primary or secondary color for E, F, and G. The same for all 3. I suggest not using violet because it is so dark, or yellow because it is so light, because we're going to be playing around with the lightness and darkness on these exercises, and sometimes it's hard to show in a dark color like violet or yellow, which is so weak. Okay, how about we go with green? Green seems like a fun one. So I'm going to be using green at the start of each one of these and then following along with the instructions. Alright, exercise E says, a shade is a color plus black to create a darker version. So make a puddle of your chosen color on a mixing tray, enough to fill a small section of the tray. Use your color to paint in the first leftmost box completely. Then use an extra paintbrush, a small one, to add a small drop of black into your puddle of color in the mixing tray. So that's going to continue. So let's first start by mixing a puddle of, I said I was going to do green. Alright, so that's probably like the size of a quarter. It's a puddle of green in my mixing tray. I'm going to be using it for this entire row. Use your color to paint in the first leftmost box completely. Use an extra paintbrush, a small one, to add a small drop of black into your puddle of color in the mixing tray. I'm going to use this brush, and I'm going to get just a little bit of black on the end. I don't know if that's going to focus, but I've got just a little bit of black, not too much. Stir with a clean brush and fill in the second box with the color shade. Okay, clean my brush out, sorry. Okay, picking that up. Now I'm filling in the second box. Could look a little darker because I just added some black. Okay. Again, use a small paintbrush to add a small drop of black into the same puddle of color in the mixing tray. Stir and fill in this darker shade into the next box. Repeat so that each box to the right gets darker and darker. Okay, so using my other brush, picking up a little bit of black, mixing it into the same tray. Ooh, pretty dramatic there. Okay, so should be darker. Now I'm gonna fill in this box. Might be hard for you guys watching because you got some glare from my lighting, but it should look like a darker shade of green, because shade actually means shadow. We're making shades of green here. We're changing the value to make it darker. By the time I get over here, it's predominantly black in the mixture. There's not much of that green puddle left behind. Now this is still technically green, though it's starting to look mostly black. Okay, so you should be able to see value change, shade. Alright, I just finished the shade activity for E, and I went ahead and I got some clean, fresh water for this next activity, because this time we're going to be going the opposite direction and we're going to be lightening colors, so we need clean, clear water. If you have muddy, murky water, it's going to change how the color looks. Still following along with the instructions, which say to use the same color for all three of these. So I'm still going to stick with green. F says a tint is a color plus white to create a lighter version. In true watercolors, there is no white paint, just water to make the colors more transparent or see-through, allowing the white paper to show through. Make a fresh new puddle of your chosen color, the same color as E, on a mixing tray, enough to fill a small section of the tray. A quarter-sized puddle would be great. Okay. Use your color to paint in the first leftmost box completely. Using a pipette, add 2 drops of clean water into your puddle in the mixing tray. So I'm going to add 2 drops of clean water. 1, 2. Stir with a dry clean brush. So that rinse out my brush. Clean it. And fill in the second box with this color tint. Okay, clean brush, stirring it. Again, using a pipette, add 2 drops of clean water into the same puddle of color in the mixing tray. Stir and fill in this lighter tint in the next box. Repeat so each box to the right gets lighter and more transparent. When done with F, wash off your mixing tray and get clean water. 1, 2. Clean brush. Stir. Lighter color. Next box. green to lighter green. This is a tint. I'm adding water to make it more transparent and more see-through. Next, I'm going to do exercise G, which is a tone. A tone is a gray mixture with a color to create a duller, less intense version. So row G is basically going to be row E and F happening at the same time in the same row as we go to the right. We're going to add water and black. So make a fresh new puddle of your chosen color. So I'm still sticking with green, and I'm going to mix in a new spot on my tray. Use your color to paint in the first leftmost box completely, just like the others. This one's just going to be pure green. Using a pipette, add 2 drops of clean water into the puddle, and then use a small paintbrush to add some black. Fill the second color with this tone. Again, 2 drops. And some black. The color should be appearing to get darker, but also weaker. So it's going to look grayer by the time this is dried. It might look a little bit dark right now while it's wet. Now when we give that time to dry, it should go from bright green to, it looks like it's starting to get darker, but then it starts to get weaker as well because it's getting grayer. Black plus water makes it a tone. Here we had darker, here we had lighter, here we have grayer. So we have our shade, which is like black, shadow, tint, which is like adding white, but we're adding water, and tone is like adding gray, doing both.